October 13, 1943. The air in southern Italy was heavy with dust and the faint scent of olive groves crushed beneath the boots of advancing armies. On that morning, the Italian government had formally declared war on Germany, turning its former ally into an enemy. Yet for the German soldiers captured in the days that followed, that diplomatic shift was less shocking than what they now saw hanging from the shoulders of the American infantrymen escorting them. It was not the rifles, not the machine guns mounted on jeeps. It was a squat, heavy weapon with a wooden stock and a drum or box magazine jutting beneath it. The Thompson Submachine Gun. The Germans trudged down a rutted road, their helmets hanging low, their hands raised or bound, their faces hollow with the fatigue of retreat. They were trained to face Garens, Springfields, and Brownings, serious weapons for a serious war. But the sight of the Thompson struck them as something incongruous, almost absurd. Was this not the weapon of gangsters? The gun of Al Capone and shadowed figures spraying bullets into the smoke-filled air of Prohibition speakeasies? To see it here, wielded by grinning American infantrymen in dusty combat gear, seemed at first a cruel joke. But the memory of its sound silenced any temptation to laugh. Some of the prisoners had already faced it in the stone villages of the Liri Valley or the twisting passes near Salerno. They remembered the staccato thump, deeper and heavier than their own MP-40s. The German submachine gun spat quick, light bursts of 9mm fire, efficient, controlled, almost clinical. The Thompson roared like a jackhammer tearing through stone. Its .45 caliber rounds could rip through walls, knock men off their feet, leave them broken before they could aim a reply. And so, as the prisoners shuffled past their captors, their eyes betrayed a private unease. One American corporal leaned casually against a cart, the Thompson dangling from his shoulder as though it weighed nothing. He was young, no older than 21, with freckles half hidden by grime. To him, the weapon was not exotic. It was standard issue for close-quarters combat. The irony that his grandfather might have read about this very gun in crime headlines of the 1920s did not matter. For him, it was simply a tool that kept him alive in the claustrophobic alleys of Italian towns. The Germans whispered among themselves, their words hushed, anxious, disbelieving. They had been taught to see America as undisciplined, its military a patchwork of Hollywood spectacle and industrial arrogance. Yet here, even in the hands of a boyish corporal, the Thompson looked menacing. One prisoner muttered that it was a wasteful design, too heavy, too short-ranged, too hungry for ammunition. Another reminded him of what they had seen in combat: American soldiers firing bursts that shattered door frames and silenced machine-gun nests. Wasteful, perhaps, but effective. The narrator's voice would remind us here that the Thompson was no accident of war. It had been designed after the First World War as a trench broom, a weapon meant to clear dugouts and bunkers. It arrived too late for that conflict, but it found an unexpected afterlife in America's street. By the 1930s, newspapers had immortalized it as the gangster's gun. When the Second World War began, however, the U.S. Army rediscovered its brutal utility. By 1943, nearly 1 million had been shipped overseas. In the villages of Italy, it was no relic, it was a revelation. A German lieutenant, his gray uniform stained with sweat and mud, studied the Americans with narrowed eyes. He thought back to his training in Bavaria, where instructors mocked the Thompson as a symbol of America's decadence. The Reich, they said, would fight with precision and efficiency, not with the vulgar spray of gangsters. But the lieutenant had lost half his platoon in a night assault outside Naples, when Thompsons cut them down as they tried to storm a farmhouse. Precision had not saved them then. The POWs moved into the holding area, a rough patch of field ringed by barbed wire. American guards lounged by the perimeter, their Thompsons propped against fence posts or resting across their knees. The Germans could not help but glance at the weapons, and the Americans noticed. One GI smirked, raising his weapon slightly as if to say, "Yes, this is real, and yes, you were right to fear it." The exchange needed no translation. In that moment, perception began to shift. What had been dismissed as theatrical became, in their eyes, a symbol of American adaptability. The gangster's gun had been reborn as a soldier's ally. It was as though the Americans had taken the chaos of their own streets and turned it into a tool of war. For the Germans, the sight was unnerving, not because the Thompson was perfect, but because it revealed something unexpected about their enemy. The camera of memory would linger here. The rough wood of the stock, worn by countless hands, the metallic gleam of the bolt, the thick magazine heavy with .45 rounds. Each detail was both mundane and terrifying. The Germans had fought with weapons engineered to be light, efficient, and economical. The Thompson was none of those things. It was heavy, clumsy, costly, and devastating. It embodied a kind of excess that Germany could not afford, yet America could. One prisoner, later interviewed in a POW camp in Kansas, recalled the moment with a mixture of awe and bitterness. "We laughed at their wastefulness," he said, "but when the shooting began, it was we who ran." His words capture the heart of the shift. Mockery giving way to grudging respect, contempt transforming into fear. The sun dipped way to grudging respect, contempt transforming into fear. The sun dipped lower as the prisoners settled into the field, the Americans standing watch with weapons slung casually yet ready. The day had begun with political betrayal, Italy turning on Germany, but for these men, the deeper betrayal was of expectation itself. They had expected a soft enemy, armed with clumsy tools. What they found was an adversary who wielded even a so-called gangster's gun with lethal efficiency. As the evening shadows stretched across the camp, a strange silence settled. Somewhere in the distance, artillery rumbled, and the war pressed on. The Germans sat in small groups, heads bowed, stealing glances at the Thompsons. For them, the image was unforgettable. The sound of its fire still echoed in their minds, the thump of bullets cracking stone and flesh. They would never again dismiss it as a weapon of criminals. What they did not yet know was that this was only the beginning. The Thompson was not just a gun, it was a symbol of something far larger. It told a story about America's resources, its culture, its contradictions, and its resolve. And in the months ahead, as battles raged across Italy, that symbol would take on a meaning far more profound than they could imagine. The Thompson was a weapon that seemed to exist in two worlds at once, and the Germans who stared at it across the wire in Italy struggled to reconcile those worlds. In their minds, it carried the shadows of American gangsters, the smoky rooms of Chicago speakeasies, the grainy photographs of men in fedoras blasting away from the windows of stolen cars. Yet here it was, slung over the shoulder of a 20-year-old soldier who barely knew what Prohibition had been. To him, it was not an artifact of crime but a soldier's lifeline, a tool made deadly by the press of war. American infantrymen in Italy laughed when asked about the weapon's reputation. "Gangster gun?" one GI scoffed in a letter home. "I don't care if Al Capone used it or Bugs Bunny. If it clears a house and keeps me breathing, it's the best thing I ever carried." That letter, read decades later, reveals the blunt practicality of men on the line. They were not fighting in the clean ranges of theory but in the cluttered villages of the Leary Valley, where each doorway hid the possibility of an ambush. The Thompson thrived there. Its short barrel and heavy punch made it a weapon of immediacy, a gun designed to decide life or death in seconds. German MP-40s were lighter, easier to handle, and far more numerous. But the Thompson's .45 ACP rounds hit with a force that felt almost personal. American soldiers said one shot could knock a man flat, and that was all the persuasion they needed. In the close alleys of Monte Cassino, where rubble choked the streets and stairways turned into killing grounds, the Thompson earned its reputation not through myth but through necessity. Yet even necessity carried irony. The gun had been expensive to produce, nearly 3 times the cost of the MP-40, and heavy in the hands. In the neat columns of military accounting, it might have looked wasteful. But the United States had an abundance that Germany could not match, abundance of money, of factories, of steel and wood and ammunition. The Thompson was not just a weapon. It was a symbol of a nation that could afford to turn extravagance into routine. German prisoners stared at it and muttered about American wastefulness, yet in their private thoughts they understood the deeper meaning. America could waste what others could not. There was something about the sound of it, too. Soldiers remembered the way it rattled against stone, the way its bursts echoed through stairwells and courtyards. One German corporal described it in his diary. "Our MP-40 chattered, theirs thundered." He wrote of the fear that spread through his men when they realized the Americans carried these in numbers, not just among officers or specialists but in the hands of ordinary infantry. The shock was not that America possessed such weapons, but that it gave them so freely to its youngest fighters. In that sense, the Thompson embodied both worlds, the romanticized chaos of American streets and the brutal clarity of war. For some GIs, the connection was even a source of humor. They joked about being Capone's boys when they stacked their weapons in camp. They carved names into the stocks, painted crude designs, personalized them as though they were more than issued tools. The Germans, disciplined in their uniformity, found this bewildering. To them, weapons were state property, not extensions of a man's identity. But to Americans, perhaps shaped by a culture of individuality, even the Thompson became personal. One sergeant recalled storming a farmhouse outside Salerno. His squad had taken fire from upstairs windows, bullets cracking against stone walls. He ordered 2 men forward, both carrying Thompsons. They burst inside, climbed the narrow staircase, and let loose with short bursts. The noise was overwhelming, wooden beams splintering, plaster falling. When it was over, the Germans who had been firing were silent. "That's what it was made for," the sergeant told an interviewer after the war, a weapon that said, "No second chances." To German prisoners, such stories spread quickly, whispered with unease. They had laughed once, months earlier, when told the Americans carried gangster guns. But laughter gave way to respect, and respect gave way to dread. A weapon that seemed almost absurd in theory had become deadly in practice. Their expectations had been betrayed by the realities of combat, and that betrayal left a wound deeper than the physical losses. It was a wound to pride, to the belief that Germany's discipline and efficiency would always outmatch America's apparent recklessness. Statistics deepen the picture. By the end of 1943, more than 500,000 Thompsons had been distributed across U.S. forces. Some were carried by officers, others by tank crews, engineers, and paratroopers. The weapon's reach was not limited to one theater or one type of unit. It was everywhere. The Germans, struggling with supply shortages and rationed ammunition, saw in this ubiquity a reminder of their enemy's industrial scale. The Thompson was not just a machine gun. It was proof that America could turn even a cultural oddity into mass reality. And yet, in the middle of this grim contrast, there was humor, humor born of irony. A British officer once remarked, "Leave it to the Yanks to bring a Chicago nightclub to the hills of Italy." His words, part sarcasm and part admiration, captured the dual image perfectly. The Thompson was ridiculous and sublime, clumsy and effective, heavy and indispensable. Its contradictions mirrored the contradictions of the war itself, where nations defined by propaganda met realities that refused to fit into neat categories. The Germans, sitting behind wire under the watchful gaze of American guards, felt those contradictions pressing on them. They were not defeated by one weapon alone, but the sight of the Thompson drove home a truth they struggled to admit. The enemy they had been told was soft, indulgent, and unserious was anything but. Those soldiers in dusty uniforms, their Thompsons slung low, were not symbols of weakness but of a strength rooted in excess, in adaptability, in the willingness to fight with whatever tool worked best. It was not easy for the prisoners to confess this, even to themselves. Pride demanded excuses. They muttered that Americans wasted ammunition, that they fought like cowboys rather than professionals, that their firepower was a crutch. But beneath the mutters was the memory of plastered dust and splintering beams, of comrades cut down before they could lift their rifles. Beneath the pride was fear, and fear, once planted, grew. The Thompson was no masterpiece of design, no paragon of elegance. It was, instead, a brute force answer to a brutal question. And in its ugly efficiency, it revealed a different kind of mastery, the mastery of industry, of abundance, of improvisation. That mastery was what truly unnerved the Germans, more than the weapon itself. For if America could turn a gangster's relic into a soldier's scourge, what else might it do before the war was done? The sun dipped again over the Italian hills as guards paced with Thompsons in hand, the prisoners stealing uneasy glances. They could not laugh now. What they had once mocked was proving to be the instrument of their undoing. And though they did not yet know it, the lessons of that day would deepen, leading them to question not just a weapon but the very myths they had been raised to believe. The prisoners sat in the field that evening, staring at the Thompsons slung across the shoulders of their guards, and they began to talk quietly among themselves. Some whispered with a bitterness that sounded rehearsed, repeating lines from the propaganda they had once swallowed without question. America, they said, was a nation of money and machines, a land of chewing gum and jazz music, more theater than strength. Their officers had told them this from the start. The United States was decadent, its people too soft for a long war. But as they looked at the weapons resting in the dirt, they sensed a truth they did not want to name. The Reich had prepared them to see Americans as improvisers at best, clowns at worst. The Thompson seemed to confirm it. A gangster's relic, far too expensive, firing ammunition so heavy that even the most disciplined soldier might burn through his supply in minutes. Efficiency was the German creed, and efficiency scorned such waste. Yet the battlefield had already betrayed this creed. What the Reich had mocked, the Americans had turned into doctrine. That contradiction gnawed at the prisoners' pride more than hunger or captivity. A German lieutenant, still streaked with the dust of retreat, remembered the words of Joseph Goebbels himself. In a speech broadcast the year before, the propaganda minister sneered that America's war industry was a circus of commerce, a machine of advertising more than arms. The lieutenant had laughed then. He had believed it. Yet in the days before his capture, he had seen tanks roll past emblazoned with American stars, supply trucks lined up in endless convoys, and weapons like the Thompson in the hands of men barely out of boyhood. If this was a circus, it was one that crushed armies beneath its tents. The Americans seemed to operate by different rules, and those rules unsettled the Germans. They had been trained to ration every bullet, to treat equipment as sacred because resources were always short. They knew the pain of scarcity. Rubber, oil, food, ammunition, all rationed, guarded, stretched to breaking. But the Americans lived in abundance. Their soldiers carried chocolate in their packs, cigarettes by the carton, ammunition belts heavy with .45 rounds as though the factories back home would never stop. To the Germans, that abundance was alien, almost grotesque, yet undeniably powerful. Statistics would later confirm what they sensed in their gut. By 1943, American industry had outproduced every other nation in the war. Hundreds of thousands of Thompsons had already been built, alongside Garand's, Browning machine guns, and a flood of tanks and trucks. Ford and General Motors churned out vehicles not by the hundreds but by the tens of thousands. Savage Arms stamped Thompsons in quantities the Germans could scarcely imagine. To the Reich, where each weapon was a calculation of cost and scarcity, the sheer scale was unthinkable. One prisoner muttered bitterly that the Americans could throw away bullets the way they threw away chewing gum wrappers. The men around him laughed softly, but their laughter carried unease. There was a truth inside the joke. American soldiers did fire with abandon. They could afford to. And each burst of gunfire was a reminder of a nation so rich in resources that waste became strategy. In the eyes of the guards there was no sense of strain, no weight of scarcity. They lounged by the wire with their Thompsons propped against posts, joking with one another, sharing cigarettes, offering water to their prisoners with a casualness that cut deeper than cruelty might have. They did not seem like men stretched thin by war. They seemed like men carried forward on a tide too large to resist. For the Germans, raised to see discipline and sacrifice as the only path to victory, that casual confidence was maddening and terrifying. There were testimonies later from POW camps in America, fragments of memory preserved by interviewers and letters home. One German corporal admitted, "We thought them cowboys, careless. But they had everything, more than we could dream. Their waste was our defeat." Another confessed that he had feared not the Americans' discipline but their excess, their ability to drown the battlefield in fire and supply until resistance felt meaningless. These words, spoken in hindsight, reflected the private thoughts that first took root in those Italian fields. The irony of the Thompson was almost poetic. It was not elegant like the Mauser rifle, not efficient like the MP-40, not precise like the German machine guns. It was ugly, heavy, costly, and American to its core. Yet it was everywhere. The sight of it forced the prisoners to confront a truth larger than the weapon itself. America's power was not in refinement but in scale, not in elegance but in abundance. What Germany called weakness was turning into a strength they had no answer for. Even humor carried a sting. An American private, perhaps sensing the prisoners' glances, grinned and lifted his Thompson slightly as if to perform for them. "Capone sends his regards," he quipped to his comrades, who laughed. The Germans did not understand the words, but they understood the laughter, the ease with which the Americans made light of a weapon that had already taken so many lives. To them, it felt like arrogance, yet beneath that arrogance was a confidence rooted in something undeniable, a nation that could afford to laugh while it armed its men with expensive weapons and endless bullets. The lieutenant who remembered Goebbels's speech closed his eyes and thought of Bavaria. He had believed that discipline, order, and scarcity honed into efficiency would triumph over chaos and excess. But here in Italy, chaos and excess wore uniforms, carried Thompsons, and marched with an ease that mocked his training. The Reich had promised him a war of precision. Instead, he had been swallowed by a war of abundance. The day faded, and the prisoners settled into silence. Their thoughts lingered not only on their capture but on what it revealed. The Americans had shown them something more unsettling than victory. They had shown them a world where weakness and waste turned into strength, where a gangster's relic became an army's tool, where a nation's wealth could rewrite the rules of war. The Germans could not yet articulate the full weight of that revelation, but they felt it pressing on them nonetheless. They had lost a battle, yes, but they had also lost a certainty, the belief that their enemy was unserious. That loss was deeper, harder to heal, and in its quiet way, more dangerous. As night fell over the camp, the sound of distant artillery rolled across the hills. The guards checked their Thompsons, adjusting straps, tapping magazines, preparing for whatever came next. The prisoners watched, their eyes following the weapons with a mixture of resentment and reluctant awe. They could not stop thinking about them, the weight of the wood, the gleam of the metal, the roar of their fire. They had once laughed at the Thompson. Now they wondered, with a heaviness that settled into their bones, what other surprises America still held in its vast and inexhaustible arsenal. Night in the Italian hills carried its own silence, broken only by the shuffle of boots or the distant crash of artillery. In that silence the Germans remembered. They remembered the sharp crack of rifles, the chatter of machine guns, and above them all, the low, relentless roar of the Thompson. It was a sound unlike any other, not clean or precise, but guttural, a hammering that shook stone walls and rattled nerve. Once mocked as a gangster's plaything, it had become the sound of fear. One German officer, captured outside Cassino, later admitted to an interrogator that the first time he heard it, he mistook it for demolition charges tearing through a building. Only later, when his men stumbled back, did he realize it was gunfire. The Thompson had that effect. It blurred the line between weapon and catastrophe. Soldiers who had trained on the neat mechanics of the MP40 or the elegant Mauser rifles found themselves disoriented by its sheer physicality. Each round carried weight, not just in metal, but in impact. American troops embraced that impact with a kind of rough affection. In the cramped alleys of war-torn villages, where staircases became choke points and doorways turned into traps, the Thompson was trusted like an old friend. Men spoke of it in letters as though it had a personality, heavy, stubborn, but loyal. It doesn't let you down, one private wrote home, and when it speaks the other fellow listens. That mixture of humor and grim truth gave the weapon a place in American hearts far beyond its mechanical design. For the Germans, however, it was no laughing matter. In Monte Cassino's rubble, squads had been shredded by bursts they never saw coming. At Anzio, night patrols flinched at the echo of its bark across the dunes. And during street fighting in Naples, civilians later recalled the way American submachine guns filled the dark with a roar so constant it seemed impossible any man could survive within it. The Thompson became not just a tool of battle but a presence, one that clung to memory long after the shooting ended. The irony was bitter. The same Germans who had once laughed at the American tendency toward excess now found themselves dreading the embodiment of that excess. The Thompson consumed more ammunition than most commanders would consider practical, weighed nearly twice as much as the MP40, and cost a fortune to manufacture. But America's factories turned out enough to arm paratroopers, engineers, officers, and infantry alike. What seemed ludicrous on paper became terrifying in practice. Scarcity had shaped the German mind. Abundance now reshaped their fear. Inside the POW camps, this shift played out in whispered confessions. Prisoners compared notes, speaking of comrades lost in doorways, of bunkers cleared in seconds, of the way a Thompson burst could pin a squad to the ground with its sheer ferocity. One man admitted, almost in shame, that he had once boasted of the MP40's superiority, lighter, sleeker, more modern. But in the ruins, he said softly, we wanted our own Thompsons. His fellow prisoners did not argue. The Americans, for their part, seemed almost oblivious to the psychological weight they carried. They carried their Thompsons casually, leaning them against walls while they smoked, slinging them across their backs as though they were no more than shovels. To German eyes, that casualness was unnerving. A weapon they now dreaded was, to its wielder, a companion as ordinary as a canteen. That disparity deepened the gulf between the two sides, a reminder that the Americans lived in a different relationship to war. Historians would later note that by 1944 the Thompson was already giving way to the M3 grease gun, a cheaper, simpler weapon that could be produced in far greater numbers. But in the Italian campaign, the Thompson still reigned, its wooden stock and heavy magazine a familiar silhouette against the horizon. It was, in its way, the last gasp of an older era, a weapon designed with craftsmanship rather than economy, carried into a war where economy mattered less to America than to anyone else. The Germans understood that shift all too well. For them, every round of ammunition was counted, every weapon rationed, every tank the product of a calculation between need and scarcity. The Americans seemed free of those chains. The Thompson became the symbol of that freedom, the visible reminder that America's strength lay not only in its soldiers but in its bottomless reserve. To fight against that was to fight not just men but the weight of an entire industrial world. One captured lieutenant, reflecting years later, admitted that the humiliation of captivity was sharpened by the memory of those weapons. We had been told they were weak, he said. But weakness does not fire forever. Weakness does not throw bullets into stone walls until they collapse. Weakness does not laugh while it drowns you in gunfire. His words echoed what many of his fellow prisoners had already felt, a betrayal not only by their own leaders but by their own assumptions. Even civilians in Italy carried impressions of the weapon. Some spoke of the comfort they felt when they saw American soldiers patrolling with Thompsons slung at their side. To them, it meant protection, a promise that the chaos of war might be held at bay. Others remembered the fear. Bursts of fire echoing through narrow streets, plaster raining down, windows shattering. For the people caught between armies, the Thompson was both salvation and terror, a reminder that liberation and destruction often wore the same face. As the war pressed forward, the Thompson's legend grew. For German POWs, the transformation was complete. What had once been the butt of jokes became the shadow that haunted their nights. They no longer thought of Chicago gangsters or Prohibition headlines. They thought of Casino, Salerno, Anzio, the places where the Thompson spoke with authority and left them broken. Its identity had shifted from relic of crime to emblem of fear, and in that shift lay the essence of America's place in the war. A nation that could take the unexpected, the absurd, and turn it into strength. The prisoners sat in silence under the barbed wire, their eyes following the guards as they paced with Thompsons at the ready. Some clenched their jaws, others lowered their gaze, but none could ignore the sight. It was not just a gun anymore. It was the embodiment of a truth they did not want to face, that the enemy they had underestimated carried with him not only firepower but the weight of a world that could not be stopped. And in the months ahead, as the war shifted from Italy to France, they would discover that the Thompson was only the beginning. America had other weapons, other machines, other symbols of power waiting to step onto the stage. What they had seen in those dusty villages was not the full measure of their opponent, but only the first shadow of a storm still gathering beyond the horizon.